Today on the podcast, you hear from Logan and you hear from Matt from the Centurions Guild. These are veterans reflecting on war, peace, and its cost on human lives theologically. So buckle your safety belt. But first, let me tell you that this podcast this week is sponsored by Subverting the Norm. The conference, November 5th to 7th in Springfield, Missouri. That's right, at Drury University. This event, sponsored by Phillips Theological Seminary, friends of the podcast, is bringing together at this third Subverting the Norm theologians and activists and church practitioners to reflect on politics and postmodern theology in church practice. So if you're a church practitioner, if you're a theologian, if you are an activist, all those people will be present, active, and reflecting together about theory, practice, postmodernity, and I would love for you to join us. So head on over to subvertingthenorm.com or come to Homebrewed, click through, you'll find out. And when you go and get your ticket, use the code HBCSTN. That's right, HBCSTN. You'll get the best discount possible. Then we'll know you're coming. And if you use the code, I will buy you a pint at Mother's Brewing Company with all the other deacons that are in his house. More than that. More than the discount. More than a pint with me. Know that Jack Caputo's going to be there. Just Catherine Keller is going to be there. Alton Pollard, who I've not seen in a long time, but I remember him, was inspired by him back in the day when he was at Wake Forest University. He's going to be there. There is just so much exciting stuff happening at Subverting the Norm. It would be ridiculous to miss it. This is the event you want to go to. You should go. And when you go and it's awesome, I'll say you're welcome. Not only that, you're going to get to hear about my brand new book at that event. Yeah, I'm gonna talk about the brand new book, Jesus, the Guide to Jesus. Liar, Lunatic, Lord are just freaking awesome. It's gonna come out right then. You'll be able to get the book. You'll be able to hear about the book, and I'm gonna talk about Jesus. Jack Caputo's brand new book, Confessions of a Postmodern Philosopher. It comes out then. You'll be able to get that. We're going to talk about it because we got a podcast. And then Jack and I are doing a pregame November 4th, a one-day event from noon on. And what is it? When Philosophers Talk About God. So if you want like an extra 6 hours of philosophical reflection about when philosophers talk about God, and then to go out and have some dinner and drinks with Jack Caputo and I and take a selfie with Jack Caputo, then sign up for the Theology Nerd Boot Camp, the pregame When Philosophers Talk About God. Boom. So let's head on into the podcast. And as we do, just want to say thank you to Matt, Isaac from the Centurions Guild. It was awesome. It was awesome. And head on over to their website. You can get some free content, get some downloads, and connect with them. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It was a wonderful conversation. And Matt, as you'll find out, is a high school friend of mine. You may or may not hear about some really sweet stuff from high school, but we'll listen to the podcast. And more than that, you'll hear some really amazing stories and be challenged to think about the issues of war, peace, its cost, on the ground, reflecting on the real lived experience of our soldiers and those they interact with. It's a powerful, powerful conversation. Yep. So, just know, heads up, a few things are going to come out soon. The Great God Debacle. The God Debacle is going to be happening in October. That's right. So be prepared. LaRon Schultz versus Philip Clayton talking about God and science. We have another live podcast coming out at the beginning of October. It's going to be in Los Angeles around Peter Rollins' Soapbox event. So that's going to be there. We got a live podcast with Jürgen Moltmann in November at the American Academy of Religion in Atlanta. We have some beginnings in September of some amazing classes and things that if you are a member of the Homebrewed community, you get access to. So if you're a member of the Homebrewed community, if you're an elder or you're a bishop, then in September, we start a year-long class, Epic Reads with Philip Clayton. First book up, Crucified God. First session, Introduce Crucified God. Thought of Jürgen Moltmann. Then you have a couple weeks. Then we come back and we walk through the text Crucified God. It's an epic read. It's an epic read class. Philip Clayton and I, year-long class. We're going to read some Moltmann, Elizabeth Johnson, Plato, Augustine, John Sobrino, Whitehead. Boom. Anyway, join the Homebrewed Christianity community to join the nerdery. There's going to be a new class on postmodern spirituality coming up. There's going to be one on, well, I can't tell you everything now. All right? Look, there's a lot going on. So head on over to homebrewedchristianity.com. You'll find out more. Sign up for the newsletter. That's the easiest way to keep up with it. Make sure you use the code HBCSTN when you sign up for Subvert the Norm. But buckle your theological safety belts, friends. Because Logan Isaac, Matt Moorman, Centurion's Guild, right now. Boom. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. Today you're going to get to meet two people, one of which has known me for a long time, Matt Moorman, and he can verify that I have always been as awesome as you think I've been. And my friend Logan, his friend Logan Isaac, who and they are here. They are part of the Centurions Guild, which we're going to hear a lot about. But before we jump in, I just want to tell Matt, thank you. It's always cool to get to reconnect with friends, and especially if there's a reason to have them on the podcast. So how's North Carolina?
North Carolina is actually, the temperature-wise, quite nice right now. It's a bit overcast, so I'm enjoying the 103 degree with 115% humidity. That's nice.
And I feel like summers are just a way to work on contemplative prayer in North Carolina. It's kind of they slowly let you purify yourself as you get closer to hell, or at least Satan's armpit.
Or you're already in hell and you just don't know it yet.
Oh, well, I'm not the one sitting at Duke University. But we don't need to discuss just how near you are to the devils. So let's jump in. I want to hear how you two met. The moment Matt met you, Logan, he started talking to me about you, and it really connected just as the onlooker friend. Lots of little different conversations Matt's been having over the years and experiences. And so it's always good to get to hear the story of how another person blessed my friend, and y'all are working together to work with other vets and stuff like that. So tell us how y'all ended up connecting.
Sure. So it was the Moral Monday protests last year. I think they're still ongoing. But we had one big march, and I just committed to myself and to friends, like, if I have a Monday open, I'm going to do it. I was working most Mondays, and this one Monday, July, it was probably later.
February.
Wow.
February, yeah.
There was one of the marches, and I had coordinated with some other vet friends of mine that were coming from out of town through an anti-war organization by the name of Iraq Veterans Against the War. And so I'm there with a couple of my friends through IVAW, and Matt and a couple other guys that just came up to the march and saw this big anti-war veteran signs. They just joined us, and so on that march is when we kind of got to know one another, and then we followed up. And over the last year and a half or so, we just kept in touch about how the church talks about war and Christianity, and what to do with the fact that we've served in the military, but that military service is too often reduced in public discourse to either ors. So the pacifist claim of, like, if you're a Christian, you must be out of the military, or the patriot claim of, like, well, all Christians are soldiers and all soldiers are Christians. We both have had experiences that complicate that formula.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been kind of exploring the different ways that our experiences have informed our faith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so maybe one thing that might help is for you to say a bit about how you came to faith, or how your faith was a part of your decision or to enter the military or to go to war. Biographically, how do y'all process your own kind of faith journey and getting into the military, having now, looked back after you've left and are advocating things that most vets probably don't get wonderfully comfortable with? How do you tell those two stories?
For me, I mean, our stories are quite different, as are everyone's stories, really. I grew up, in a typical mainline liberal tradition. My grandfather was a Navy chaplain, as you know. That really shaped me, so I grew up in one sense quite comfortable with the notions of being a Christian and being even leaning towards the pacifist, side of the spectrum, but also with military service. It's funny because I remember in college you used to call me the pacifist with a gun, and that was,
it was a term of endearment.
Yes, it was. And there was, it's interesting kind of looking back on that, because my, coming from a mainline liberal tradition, I didn't have a moment of conversion really in life. I've had moments where I've grown and my faith has been challenged. One of those was, the Bible study that we were in high school. I think for me, I always had attention, and I did Navy ROTC my freshman year at NC State, and that was 2001, and September 11th happened that year, and so I was right in the mix of both having lots of friends who knew nothing about the military and who were engaging in theology and church, and then also being a part of this organization where I had to hear a lot of breastfeeding and a lot of anger and a lot of the stuff that I think a lot of us had to listen to in kind of around that time. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there was always a tension between these two things and trying to understand that. For me, it was a personal journey, I think, and taking and then I ended up quitting at the end of my freshman year and enlisting in the Air Force Reserve, and that's how I served. And for me, it was trying to understand that how those two things are connected. And if I'm going to talk about empire, I think right around that time I read The Irresistible Revolution in trying to understand my complicity, my how I participate in empire, mm-hmm. and also how I can subvert that. And maybe there was a way to be in the military and do that, and maybe there wasn't. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was like exploring those two things.
Yeah. So how about you, Logan?
My story only differs fundamentally in that when I was growing up, there wasn't a big tension. My mom and dad my dad's an agnostic. My mom is probably something very close to an agnostic. But she goes to church when I'm at home and always has. So when I went to youth group after I was arrested shoplifting, and my sense was like, church is what you do because you've done something, or after you've done something wrong. And in youth group, it was just kind of it was a social event. Mm-hmm. But you'd hear about stories from the Bible, but for the most part, I mean, the same kind of relationships exist on Wednesday night as they do during the days of the week, like at school. And so I was never really impressed. And I did want to get more education. So in 2000, I enlisted for the GI Bill. When my scores were high enough, I got to choose whatever I wanted, and I only chose it was the fire support specialist because it had the most money. But the title is kind of ambiguous. A lot of people think it's a firefighter, where it's actually an artilleryman. And so I went through. I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as a paratrooper when the towers fell. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us there just kind of we fell into the nationalist kind of tendencies of vengeance for 9/11 as opposed to maybe more temperate kind of motivations. Mm-hmm. But I didn't end up deploying with Fort Bragg. At my 2-year mark, I re-enlisted to go to Hawaii, and I deployed from Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, on Oahu. And it wasn't until I was in Iraq and shortly after and coming home that I was thinking about combat in terms of my faith, because I grew up in Orange County, California, and faith there is like everything else. It's very superficial. And so faith was something that I put on when it was called for, when it benefited me. But then in combat, I learned that some things are very important and some things are real and some things are not important at all and are really just Holden Caulfield, the character written by J.D. Salinger, mm-hmm. The character produced in World War II in Europe. He was producing chapters for Catcher in the Rye while he was a soldier in Europe. And there were things that were important and real, and there were things that were phony and just not worthy of my time and attention. And my faith came under the microscope, and I wanted to not be a phony. And so I remember thinking explicitly to myself, as a forward observer for the artillery, working in infantry units, I would be a hypocrite to do that and also be reading and allowing the scriptures to shape my life. And so there was a clear choice that I knew I had to make. And so I wanted to figure out what this Christian faith thing was. And I found very quickly that the call to love one's enemy was mutually exclusive of my responsibility, professional responsibility of calling for indirect fire assets. Mm-hmm. However, the first theological book I read John Yoder's "What Would You Do If," where he basically takes the claim that Christian realists make, or the argument that Christian realists will argue to pacifists. What would you do if wife are in danger, kids, grandmother, whatever? And Yoder kind of deconstructs it and shows how illogical it is. But I read that in uniform, loading vehicles onto a boat to go back to Iraq. So I got into some pacifist circles, and in them I was told that being a Christian in the military is inherently mutually exclusive. Like simply by being in the military, you're violating your Christian convictions. That soldiers are much more proximate to evil, if not the embodiment of evil. And that I just need to recognize that. But that, on the other hand, as I said, I could not reconcile loving my enemies with calling for fire. So there's got to be a middle ground. Unfortunately, it was very difficult to find people who were able to assist me in finding that middle ground and finding the mean between two excesses. So that's kind of where I found myself.
When people have that kind of encounter, I feel like, with the age at which the three of us experienced 9/11, like I was a sophomore in Bowie's Creek, not too far from you, Logan. I was going back on weekends to watch Matt's wonderfully gifted pop punk band play shows, and having conversations with a lot of the soldiers that were students at Campbell, to the leaders on all the Christian campus groups, because I tried out Jesus on my friends, and I felt like we were always pigeonholed where you had to take some kind of absolutist position. And I wonder how much of that just is the fact that from 18 to 25, there's only really allowed to be one universe, and it's the one that you're in, and your identity's so attached to being in the right place, be it a pacifist. And I'm like hardcore pacifist, like so pacifist, I'm going to destroy everything you love about yourself if you don't agree with me. And I'm a United States citizen, and I love Jesus. And you want to know, if you didn't love me, you would be a Nazi or a Muslim, because we killed people, and you must hate Jesus if you don't, it's like the time all the anxiety and energy of 9/11 happened, everyone ran to some corner. And those of us in draftable ages with some conscience go, oh my God. They ask the question what you were asking, like, well, what's really real? What's really important? And I feel like so often we were pushed to have some absolutist position and then defend it. And what you're just both describing in different ways is this desire to raise the question and actually talk and engage across difference. And I think that maybe now we're having where the tension's gone down enough, or we've lived with it long enough to ask questions we couldn't have asked then because of just the heat.
Yeah, and it's tragic that we have to, this happens after the dust has settled. But I think, like what you talked about, the experience is much more persuasive than logic at times. And one of the things so as I began figuring out what it is that I believed and then what I should do, was in connecting with and talking to other Christian soldiers, some of whom were radically pacifist, became conscience objectors, and others that, would put Jesus on their rifle or their scope and run off to war. But I had the benefit of being able to sit with folks like myself long enough to help me understand who I was being called to be, and what like it might mean to be a Christian soldier. So very quickly I came across the stories of other figures in history, and not just, in our own age. I discovered the history of the saints and hagiography. It was not long after I had decided. So long story short, I felt that I could not be an artilleryman as a Christian. I thought that does violate our Christian convictions that we're called to have. But I don't think that the military as an institution is inherently anything. I mean, an institution is what you make of it. And frankly, I didn't want to depart from friends with whom I had shared an incredible bond, people that you train with in the military. Like, I have friends from high school that I'm super close to, but I don't share the same connection with them that I do with the guys I was in the military. So I started reading the regulations, and I discovered that as an enlisted man, I could still technically be a non-combatant on paper. In reality, is another story, but I applied in May or June of 2006 to be a non-combatant conscientious objector. We'd already come down on orders, so that meant effectively I was asking to return to war with my unit, but I told them I could not, as a Christian, carry a firearm. And then the cookie crumbled. I was forced out of my unit in violation of the regulations, and I was made to watch them deploy without me in August of 2006. And then I was eventually discharged honorably in November of that year during what would have and could have been my second deployment. So I applied to be a CO, or a non-combatant CO, but it never took, so I was just discharged regularly. But I found my story to be very much similar to stories like Matt's. Stories of the saints, like Martin of Tours, I discovered shortly after, who they tolerate empire and they tolerate patriotism and nationalism to an extent, but there's often a threshold. And many of the earliest soldier saints were military martyrs because they would tell Caesar, or they would tell their recruiter, or the equivalent, the proconsuls. One of them, Maximilian of Tebessa in northern Africa, was supposed to be measured for the seal, kind of like basically dog tags. And Maximilian says, "No, I'm a Christian. I can't fight." And the proconsul says, "Well, it's an adventurous life. All the other guys are doing it. Why don't you do it?" He said, "I'm sorry. I am a Christian. It's not permitted that I fight." And so he's beheaded in front of his own father. And then just a few years later, Martin comes along, who's named after the god of war, and he wants to be a Christian, but neither of his parents are, and so it's looked down upon. He joins the military. He's good looking and he's strong, and so he's put in basically the equivalent of Secret Service in the Praetorian Guard. And what's different with Martin is that he joins the military, does not refuse, as a lot of the other soldier saints had before him, and he protects the life of Caesar. He has no problem with that. In fact, it's when he's up in northern France in the winter, and he finds a freezing beggar. And the episode that he's known for is cutting his cloak in half. And this sheepskin cloak was signified his rank and his proximity to Caesar. Cuts it in half, gives it to the freezing beggar. That night, he has a dream of Jesus before the heavenly host, saying to them, "Here is Martin, who's not even baptized, who's clothed me." Next day, he runs off, he's baptized. Pacifists, including his biographer, narrate that as he does this thing, he's baptized, he gets out. But the history that his biographer attaches to his departure, when he goes before the Caesar Julian at the Battle of Worms in Germany, I think it's modern day Strasbourg. So he's eventually comes to the field of battle for the first time and tells Caesar, just like Maximilian, "I'm a soldier, I can't fight, I'm very sorry." And so, for all intents and purposes, he would have been killed because everybody else had been up until that point. But Caesar puts him in jail, a peace treaty is negotiated, and he's released. So he's the first soldier saint to have confessed the faith, expecting martyrdom, but not having received it. So he becomes a bishop eventually. But all these stories helped me understand how my story fit as a Christian soldier in the story of God, in ways that, the propositions that between just war or pacifism were helpful, but not nearly as illustrative as finding my story as it relates to other Christian soldiers and the story of God is revealed in Scripture and the last 2,000 years of church tradition.
Mm-hmm. So when you get approached by someone who is a soldier, very much a Christian, and they'll they're ready to quote Bible verses at you for a while. What is it like to have a conversation with someone who doesn't have the sense of disturbance, or where their conscience isn't pricked by this? This is just how it is. Like, I have friends and family members who served in the military who look at you and you ask a lot of the same questions, raise these issues, and they're like, well, I don't get what your problem is. Like, I'm not the one. I'm just following orders. That's what you do if you're in the military. When you make the decision, if you don't want to follow orders, or you don't want the benefits of being in our country, that kind of thing, then, vote different. But don't tell me like I'm supposed to act different when I'm doing what I'm doing. And if you don't like it and want to deny it, that's fine, but you're still paying taxes for it. So what's the big difference between, like, how are we not just like some leftist, liberal, hippie wonky wonks who just want to pretend the world is a lot different than it is, but benefit from people who can love Jesus and recognize that this violent system is better than the other option. The other option's warlords and raping and pillaging and blah, blah, blah. Like, how do these conversations, like, how do you begin these type of conversations? Because I know lots of military people who, if you ask me, like, at their kind of like stage of moral development, they could be a wonderfully loving person to those they've identified as, the people they're to care for or belong with. And they're undisturbed by these questions, if that makes sense.
I think so. I've found, because it's disturbed me, I've found that there's always a way to be disturbed, particularly in scriptural terms. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm a pacifist, but I have a lot of hesitations with the way pacifists will often read scripture. So some pacifists kind of bulldoze through Acts 10 and Cornelius, who's a devout, God-fearing man who is a Roman soldier, never leaves the military, first Gentile baptized into the church without having, technically there's an Ethiopian eunuch that comes before Cornelius, but as a eunuch he wouldn't have had to have been circumcised. So Cornelius is the first person eligible.
Just Google it if you're confused.
So there are these contrasting images that you get, particularly at least in terms of Christian soldiers. On the one hand, we have the Centurion of great faith in Matthew 8 and Luke 7, I think, who's applauded by Jesus for having greater faith in all of Israel. And unfortunately, I think that is often misinterpreted by patriots to say, well, he's a soldier, obviously, like that's his main identifying feature. But as a soldier, he has absolute authority over the Jews, and he gives it up. Mm-hmm. And it indicates his humility before this indigenous miracle worker. Like, I remember being in Iraq, and I remember precisely how much authority I would give to indigenous people, to the Iraqis. Like, they didn't have authority. So for this person to say, Lord, I'm not worthy to take you under my roof, but only say the word and my servant shall be healed. Like, those words weren't coming out of my mouth in Iraq. They mm-hmm. never would have. So that this person should not be judged by their martial membership. It's their humility. And it happens that it's exercised by this person who would have been seen as an outsider. But on the other hand, like, we have these, like John's passion. John especially is really critical of the soldiers. It is the soldiers who crucify these. It is the soldiers who mock and slap and beat and curse. But what do you do with this figure that embodies both characters? Well, I mean, that just makes a good story. To have characters, you want to see somebody who's capable of evil as well as good. Mm-hmm. I mean, Atticus Finch. Yeah. Harper Lee just released this new book where Atticus comes out as, a very unsavory character. But that, to me, that's the indication of a very good story that we need to read very carefully and well and appreciate not just the character's moral complexity, but our own. So there's always a way to disturb people on both sides of the aisle. I mean,
I think, yeah, and it's funny because, for me, I look, being a longtime listener of Homebrew, and I find myself being quite compelled by some of the criticisms made within radical theology. And so, going back to like Bonhoeffer's initial questioning. Well, here was a guy who was, questioning everything at the same time. And for a lot of us, I think looking back on Bonhoeffer, I think, he's been claimed by so many disparate groups of people.
Yeah.
But we hold him up as, basically being a modern day saint, for his actions, for his writings, and what his life was. But he was a guy who was part of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence unit. I mean, he attempted, if he wasn't active, he was certainly complicit in assassination attempts against Hitler. So, and by the way, I think that's a lot of people like pull that up and say, see, he was okay with violence. And I don't know if that was, I don't think you could say that about Bonhoeffer, but it's more whatever people might say about him, whether he was a pacifist, whether he was a patriot who was perfectly okay with violence. I think whatever you want to say about it, it's more complex than that. And I think that's what we're getting at. That's one of the things we're getting at. We're kind of wanting to say whatever side of the spectrum you fall in, being able to say it's more complex than that. Mm-hmm. The world and life, it's more complex than that. And I think there's something to be said for let's all start with where we are, and then where we kind of submit ourselves to that criticism, to whether I'm a pacifist and I'm totally against the military and any form of violence at all, or whether I'm like a Christian patriot and I'm like, for me, serving in the military and being a good follower of Jesus is the one and the same thing, So I think I think you're right. I think having that humility and particularly allowing that criticism within yourself, mm-hmm. with your own understandings of what it is.
Yeah, I think it goes back to your point about like when we're 1825, we want a flat moral universe. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is that that's just not reality, and thankfully that's similarly not the scripture that we share.
Yeah.
As Christians. So it troubles me that soldiers are the ones that kill Jesus. But in Catholic and Orthodox traditions, in Matthew and Mark, where there are these soldiers, one that pierces Jesus' side, and another, possibly another, that then confesses him the Son of God before any apostle does. Catholic and Orthodox churches name those two people as one person, give them a name, Longinus. Mm-hmm. Longinus has one of the four pillars surrounding St. Peter's altar in Rome. And so Longinus, to me, represents the incredible complexity of the story of Christian soldiers that we simply cannot flatten them into one or the other.
So when you're starting something like the Centurions Guild and you're working with different veterans groups when you get back, like what are the complexities for returning vets who are politically active and also advocating for a much more compassionate, caring reception than vets had after Vietnam? Because I think that's one of the places where, Matt knows the Fuller family. My grandpa was the chief master sergeant of the Air Force. And Hiram Fuller said that he had a hard time understanding Christian pacifists because they were the worst, critics of soldiers coming back who just had their number called. And that's one of the things. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think part of what we're experiencing today, I think, our parents' generation saw all that stuff in Vietnam and people coming back and being just crapped on for things that they had no control over. Like the soldier is not part of, the soldier is not responsible for how the war ends. Soldiers, particularly when they're drafted, are essentially just cogs in a wheel. And that was actually a horrible reality. You get drafted, you go do training on your own, you go fly to Vietnam on your own, then you're part of a unit you've never met for 12 months, you come back on your own, and you come back to a society that rejected you. And so now, I think we've swung the pendulum the other way where we want to make amends for that social reality by, instead of spitting on soldiers, now we almost drown them in positive affirmation. When you say thank you to a vet, it assigns positive moral value to their experience. And that may be justified, but that also bulldozes over the traumatic experiences that war inherently is, that you can't get away from the fact that war leaves a moral mark on you. And so what I've tried to do is to caution pastors and other ministers away from assigning moral value, positive or negative. So ways we can do that, we can just say, welcome home, because it is good to be back. It's not as bad as it was in Vietnam. They're deploying entire brigades instead of individuals. I think that's actually a step forward. But on the other hand, the instinct in churches, say on Memorial Day or Veterans Day, to invite people to stand, sometimes you're asking people to recognize service that for them was morally complicated, that may have included involuntarily killing non-combatants. The example I give, which isn't my own, but which was relayed to me in convoys. I was a convoy driver for my platoon sergeant, for whatever reason, had to have me driving. And we were told over and over and over again in convoys, you don't stop, you don't throw out food. And so you see these starving kids on the side of the road, and you feel horrible for not being able to feed them, but you set up false hopes that someone's going to come along and feed them every day. Furthermore, if they jump in front of your convoy, you can't stop because it may be a trap. It may be some kind of diversion. So it's beat into your head to keep going. One young man kept going when a kid jumped in front of his Humvee, and he had to, in a split second, he had to decide between the child in front of his vehicle or the 9 soldiers geared up in the back of his truck. And he had to make very difficult choices he's going to live with the rest of his life. And on the one hand, maybe he did the right thing by preserving the lives of 9 men in the back of his truck, but maybe there's no right answer. Maybe there is no right moral answer in war, and that you have to sit with these ambiguities and listen over time to veterans share their stories on their own terms, instead of trying to project or like put our narrative onto them of their monsters or their heroes. I think the danger that does is that by typecasting them as one or the other, they don't get to self-define. And it's much easier to have the memories that we have for those of us that have been to combat and call ourselves monsters than it is to believe that we're heroes given some of the experiences we have. So that's another reason that the middle ground is really important to us.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, how did you respond? Like, I know that culturally, American Sniper raised a lot of these issues, and I was always amazed at how different people saw the movie completely differently. Either as like a perfect affirmation of what's going on, to the best, kind of explanation of the complexities of the guilt and things, to a sympathy film for nationalism. So how does like a film like that obviously was complicated enough to raise a million different things, and one that became essentially like the mirror for all of us to throw our junk up at, because, it made us able to look at something that I don't think many people have looked at, right? Like that story you just told is not one we look at. There's hardly a way you could imagine someone choosing to go to war lightly, knowing this means thousands of our soldiers are going to make those decisions and have to live with them.
Yeah.
So how, like with something like American Sniper, do you or begin a conversation that brings that complexity around rather than become the ideological goalpost for your opinion?
Yeah, I think the story of the American Sniper movie and the book and the whole constellation of stories around it was as much about Chris Kyle as it was about the guy who killed him. Because the guy who killed him was also a vet who clearly struggled with PTSD and combat trauma. And particularly as the church, we bear with those who are suffering. And Chris Kyle suffered. He had PTSD. He was beginning to recover. But so did the guy that took his life. Like, what do we do with that as Christians, as the church? How do we wrestle with the fact that the church has resources that help us think about that kind of complexity? In terms of like Chris Kyle himself, I think we want to make him one thing or the other. And it just gets at this, this flat moral universe again. Chris Kyle he had PTSD. That's not something you get over as quickly as I hear the movie suggested. I haven't seen it yet, and I'm only hesitant to see it because of the graphic scenes triggering PTSD of my own. But I am committed to seeing it because I want to know the story of that Christian soldier and how and whether and to what extent it fits in with the story of salvation history. And maybe a difficult fit. I mean, Joan of Arc is canonized, as is Maximilian Tebessa. I think it's important that the church thinks about how we go about making saints, the big S and little s, canonized saints, but also the people that we name as examples for our lives. And I don't think being a sniper is exemplary in terms of the story of salvation history. But I think that soldiers with trauma and how we think about them and how we construct theologies about war or peace, those stories should be determinative. I don't think that we should be drawing abstract propositions from the air to suggest, oh, well, in order to justify a war, in order to justify soldiering, this is what we need to think. I think that the purpose of the stories is actually much richer than that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just going to say one of the things we talked about at this last conference, and one thing that Logan and I talked about a lot, and I've talked about it with other people, is how the church goes about understanding friend and foe, like who's enemy, who's friend, and I think the way we talk about it, it could also be one way. The way the church describes this, like we talked about, praying for our vets and our service members on like Veterans Day, like around that, which is something that a lot of churches engage in. Even, mainline liberal churches do this. And it's just something, and it's like, usually it's like a line that's like thrown in and, to like a corporate rote prayer or whatever. But what does it look like to also then pray for, Iraqi and Afghanistani civilians or
terrorists,
I think being able to include all these people, and not as like, I think sometimes you get that in like a super like hippie like church, like the one I'm going to be going to. You can get it, and it feels like a slap in the face to our own service members. Like there's a way of saying that and praying for it where it's like, well, screw you guys, because these, we're with these people over here.
Look how evolved we are. We pray for Osama bin Laden.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. But I think there's maybe a way to do that where you don't have to fall on either side. And that's up to the church, to each church to kind of wrestle with. And how do you begin to do that?
One of
not
the things,
wishing harm on anyone.
Yeah, well, one of the things that made me think of is a situation at one of the church I recently finished working at, and it is a rather large UCC church in California. So, the discussion around the presence of the American flag had come up off and on, and what was so interesting is this time when the conversation around came up, it came up not because some super enlightened peacenik was like, well, let's have every flag of every country in the sanctuary, or let's put the UN flag with it. But it was a vet who was returning, struggling with PTSD, and he said, I can't come up to the communion table when that's there. Mm-hmm. And he's like, I love my country, and if I get called back again, I'll serve. He's like, I can't do that and communion at the same time.
That's good.
And what was crazy was I share this with church leadership that powerful, let's move it. Well, are you sure we should do that? Now all of a sudden, like they're worried about not the person who just served, who's coming back and should be welcome to Christ's table to try to figure out what just happened, but the person who hasn't served in a long time or has never served, and how their ideology might feel if it got moved. And to me, like that moment, like just flipped the way we need to think as a church on its head, because the questions around symbols and language and what we do in our prayers and who we pray for or don't pray for, again, like they get complicated when you actually have the conversation with the people in the room who represent the flag elsewhere. So I wonder, to me, what you mentioned this before we started talking, about combat theology, and could you say a bit about that? Because I feel like there are so many questions that we waste time arguing about in church council meetings, and that don't make sense when some reasonably informed person about the experience of actual war and combat begins to frame it, because we protect our ideologies more than we protect reality, and our patriotism tends to be the and what patriotism truly looks like tends to be what we're really protecting.
Yeah. Well, the idea for combat theology, just as a phrase, similar to Christian soldier, like Christian soldier can be heard two very different ways. In conservative circles, it's redundant. I mean, yeah, soldiers are Christians, Christians are soldiers, fine. But for pacifists, it's, that is a mutually exclusive phrase that is not appropriate. Combat theology grew out of my growing sense that what we call theology about war is too often abstract and impersonal. Mm-hmm. I sat through, I don't know how many classes at Duke, and it's at University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where I just came from, where we talk about war, and it's about, proportionality, last resort. But for Christians, war is about dismembered bodies, widows and orphans. They're about particularities. Combat is specific and personal, and it's flesh and blood. So what I want to do, what Centurion's Guild is hopefully going to be doing, is helping the church craft a martial hermeneutic, a way to interpret Scripture and culture in a way that embodies the middle ground between the scale between patriot and pacifist, because they're both appropriate parts of the spectrum, but they command inordinate amounts of attention. I think a lot of theologians are very good and very helpful resources, but I think we should notice how many theologies are being written by vets in terms of war. And I think if we believe what we believe about narration and embodiment and incarnation, we should be constructing our theologies about war based on the experiences of soldiers, not putting logical conclusions and propositions onto the experience of soldiers. And so that's what combat theology is about. It's about learning what it means to be specific and particular and personal, as opposed to generic and universalizing in our theologies.
So what are some general responses when you're kind of introducing this idea to the Hauerwasian mafia?
Oh,
I didn't know that was I've heard rumors
of it. Thing.
Okay.
Yeah. I tried to tell Logan that I was like,
I thought it was our dirty
all you Duke people, because I'm at just so the listeners know, I'm at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and Duke's just right down the road from me. I live in Raleigh, and there's listening to Tripp for a while now, and just hearing other people, there's a bit of an aura here at Duke, surrounding Hauerwas. So, anyways,
well, at Duke, I thought it was the Mennonite Mafia, and so there's actually it's interesting. So I was introduced to this idea of a Mennonite Mafia, which were a lot of Hauerwas students at Duke, and maybe it's Hauerwasian in that it's an effect that Hauerwas's methodology has produced. And that was a bunch of Mennonites at Duke who rode motorcycles and kind of looked down their noses at people who came into class in uniform.
Wait a minute. Mennonites that rode motorcycles?
Yeah, Mennonites with motorcycles.
Yeah.
Is there a picture of this?
No, that's why I wasn't sure if it was just like something that we talked about internally, or if it's. But there may be some overlap. So I
want a picture of these. It would go great with the post for this podcast. Yeah. I can imagine it though.
It's a whole episode of Homebrew right there.
Oh man,
motorcycles.
Mennonites on motorcycles. All right, sorry. That just brought a little smile to my face. Like, I wish they did something like that, but now it's been verified. Multiple attestation.
I might be crushing your dreams, but it has come to me, in particular for student vets at Duke. It's come to imply a certain kind of a certain kind of belligerence, theological belligerence that disregards, and I won't say this of Hauerwas himself, but I think there is an instinct within pacifist circles to suggest, well, no, military is inherently evil or wrong or whatever, and therefore has nothing credible to contribute to the task of theology. I think that's absolutely wrong-headed. But it has had a practical effect at Duke. I was here from 2010 to 2013. There were no less than 2 student vets. I'll mention one in particular because I was closer with him. He had deployed, been discharged honorably, and started classes at Duke in a 6-month window. And he was uncomfortable worshiping with Muslims, which we would sometimes do with Muslim Center. And people caught wind of it, and they accused him of being intolerant. But it wasn't some logical thing. It was an embodied experiential reaction within 6 months of being shot at by people that, for the military, are primarily narrated as this is Islam, this is Muslim people, as opposed to terrorists or opposed to radical whatever. And so he left because he felt that as a just warrior, he was looked down upon, and his viewpoint wasn't respected. And so the middle ground that I've tried to represent, I feel as though I've had to kind of fight an uphill battle against not just Hauerwasians or whatever, but also against patriots in the mainstream that suggest, well, pacifism has nothing to say, because I probably lean more pacifist than I do any other way. But I think that our methodologies are very important. Stanley does carry himself and produce literature that does seem kind of belligerent. I don't think that what we need in contemporary Christian culture, where we have a suicide of veterans that reaches 22 every day, 1 every 65 minutes, we don't need a bull in a china shop. We need theologians of grace that can speak to the middle ground, that can gently and reverently think through what it means to be a Christian soldier yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that's what Centurion's Guild is trying to do. We're trying to think through in narrative form, which is the Duke School of Theology, what it means that Christian faith and military service at times intersect. They are not absolutely mutually exclusive. There is some overlap, and we want to find where that overlap sits, and we want to speak with people who are caught up in that overlap in ways that they can understand, in ways that will not project our theological anxieties onto them. So one way that we do that is we recycle military language, and this was common in the early church. Evangelion, gospel, all these Latin words were recycled by the church to mean very different things. So we have a newsletter at Centurion's Guild that we call Change of Command. And in Change of Command in our newsletter, if you go to centurionsguild.org/resources, you'll find that we have all of our newsletters on Scrib. And in our little logo, you can see in the F, it's a U-turn. And in there, you can read metanoia. And a change of command ceremony in the military is when one commander is changing places with the next incoming commander. And they pass the flag, the unit guidon, the flag. They both hold it for a second. And a change of command ceremony, the ones that I witnessed, there's always this really weird pause where they would both hold the guidon and look at one another. Very awkward. But it says something about this pregnant pause that we live in today, where God's kingdom is inaugurated. It has come in the body and person of Jesus Christ, and yet we still are waiting for our earthly commander to let go of the flag. And so we're caught up in this middle ground that we want to respect and think through more critically. And stories and the phenomenon of Christian soldiers is a very fruitful way that we found to think about this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Have you tell me what I was talking to a friend the other day who he does a lot with helping churches, especially evangelical ones that kind of passed on liturgy, rites of passage, and ritual. He's talking about putting together a post-war ritual for when soldiers come back. And what is it like to be reintroduced to the congregation? Because he's, over a region for a mainline denomination, and pastors regularly go, right? Like, what do we do? Like, we either have the come now join the prophetic critique of the war, or the hooray, we're glad you're home thing. What is a way, or some ways you could imagine churches affirming the ambiguity, intensity of that type of experience and period of life, and how do you affirm the person and say, bring your questions here, let us support you, that kind of?
Yeah, well, I think it begins with that affirmation. Like Edward Tick wrote War in the Soul, and he focuses in that book on Native American rituals. And I think I don't want to co-opt another culture's rituals without a lot of due diligence. But he does, he talks about, or he suggests like that ritual is something that we're losing touch with in our culture, even in the church. And he and Karl Marlantes, who wrote What It's Like to Go to War, both propose that, even in combat, what if we had rituals that undo the dehumanization that boot camp and combat usually entail? So that might look like at the end of a major fight, you go out and you bury the dead, enemy beside enemy, and recognize that this really is something that is necessarily evil, but we don't have to lose our humanity over it. Marlantes also writes about he describes a mass for the dead that he finds helpful in the Catholic Church. But in terms of like non-denominational or low church perspectives, I think there's a way that you can think through. So I think part of it begins with affirming those parts of someone's story that are morally right, and that's why the soldier saints have helped me. We can parse out, we can separate protection from aggression. Protection is willing to give its life. Aggression is usually taking life. And there are parts of soldiering that are defensive, and there are parts that are offensive. And so I think it begins by identifying or differentiating between what's good about soldiering and what's bad, and highlighting what's good, and mourning, lamenting what's bad. And that includes something like confession. Mm-hmm. Even if that's talking with a trusted friend, some kind of religious authority in your life over a beer about what you did, because words have power, and the problem with violence is that it creates a silence. There's a young man locally that I think for the first time was able to tell someone, me, what it was like for him to kill somebody in Iraq. And he told me because he knows a vet, he knows in Iraq, and so we share a certain camaraderie that he doesn't share with his priest or his pastor. And he talked to me about after he had killed someone, they had a gun, they were aiming it at them. He was sure of it, no doubt in his mind. And as soon as he killed them, he felt a sense of elation because he had won. He kept his buddies from being hurt. He had taken out somebody who clearly represented a threat. But then within milliseconds, he felt the most crushing sense of shame he ever felt. Because no matter how you cut it, you're taking the life of another human being, even if it's necessary. And so we have to be able to look at war, for conservatives, we have to be able to look at war and identify those parts which are evil and which are morally corruptive, and lament those things. If we can call them necessary, that's fine. But don't ever call them good. Mm-hmm. Don't ever call war blanketly good, because that's just not the history. That's not the witness of the church. But the stuff that's good, we should not overlook either. And we shouldn't emphasize too much. We don't make them heroes. But we figure out, this was the beauty of the early catechists and priests, the Summa of Thomas and all the penitentials. They were aimed at priests taking confession so that they could listen to someone and say, you did this, you didn't do that, this is the extent of that sin. And they had hierarchies and taxonomies of sin instead of like this either or, you're either totally evil or you're totally innocent, which I think we get in the Protestant culture of our day. So I think that's what's most important, identifying the good from the bad and taking those seriously for what they are. The bad we lament, and the good we support and we respect.
Yeah, there are two other topics that I thought about, and I wonder what you think. One is when it goes to young men, especially ones that aren't going to be making significant amount of money at something that's successful currently, right? The markets deem that this skill or ability is worthwhile. You get meaning, purpose, value, career, all that kind of stuff. The military, because of the market's kind of reduction over life-giving vocations, is an option for people who are essentially masculine men without that's our economy no longer validates, right? Blue collar labor is not a single family income. Like I was a student minister for 15 years, either teenagers or college students. And the number of people that I saw turn to the military, not out of a sense of a vocation or calling, but because they were a young man who wanted to do something, their mom, their preacher, their friend said, yes, you're somebody. I wonder how much of this, how much of it is of what you're dealing with also contains a critique towards just the way, kind of in our contemporary culture and economy, men, masculinity, this hyper desire of what happens when hormones go crazy in dudes, doesn't have a place it can have a healthy outlet valve, how they can't have a place in the system and that kind of thing.
And I think Logan and I both fall into this category somewhat, but there's what we call the economic draft, in a sense. For me, it was, I didn't come from an awful lot of money. I was in school at State. I was screwing around, messing up. I needed to do something. I needed to take a break, and I wanted to do something that was structured, and frankly, that would give me money for school. And hence, the Air Force Reserve, they gave me an awful lot of money. I think Logan's story is kind of similar, maybe. So I think that you're right. Like, that it's a huge issue. And I think any conversation that the church has, and we talked about this like explicitly the other day, we really focused on this at one point, talking about the structural, there's the personal experience of military service members who are at war and the moral implications therein. But there's also, if you're going to say that you care, like, for instance, like at a patriot church is what we call it, you might hear the slogan, support the troops. And it's like this nameless, like what does that mean? It's completely hypothetical. It's not embodied in the least bit. And what it ends up being is like thanking service members, doing all that stuff. And like I told a story about how it's funny because we laughed about this the other day. I told a story about how I was going down to a drill weekend. I was in uniform, and already my meals are being paid for by the government. I was in the drill weekend, and I like leave this small barbecue place in Eastern North Carolina, the one that I stopped at frequently, and I went to go pay my bill, and they were like, "Oh no, the guy who came before you paid it already." And I was like, and like, so on the one hand, obviously, like I want to accept gifts that are given to me and all that stuff, but at the same time, I was like, well, first of all, he's already paid for it because, his tax dollars and all that stuff. But the second thing, I was like, is that, like, if I really needed that kind of support, that kind of, like, economic support or whatever, like, that, like, to me, that was just, someone paying for your meal. And then, like, on the one hand, it is a nice thing, but on the other hand, is that real support? Is that really supporting you? Mm-hmm. Like, if you really care about the troops, then yes, care about them personally, but also, man, we have to care about the circumstances that led to me or anyone else joining the military. First of all, that we felt it necessary or a good option, or maybe the only viable option. And secondly, we have to deal with like the politics surround the geopolitics, in fact, surrounding why this particular conflict was necessary to begin with. Why, so I think any kind of conversation that the church is having about how to minister to and accept and include and learn from military members and veterans, you also have to talk about the structural social stuff. And that's, really, that's my big thing, in my focus, thinking about political theology. We have to talk about the economics. We have to talk about it because the truth is, in Southwest Philadelphia, where I worked for a year as a social worker, you have a drug dealer on this corner, a drug dealer on this corner, a recruiter on this corner, a drug dealer on this corner, and it's like, and there is this sense, it's like, man, those are my two options.
Yeah.
Like, that's it. Those are my two options.
And what does the Mennonite Mafia think if those are the two you're picking from? Right? Like, that's why I think a bit of it is a bit of the angst for especially upper middle class, overeducated Christians is like they've never had that like sat down with someone and said, so here are the options. And like the more times I talk to students, especially ones in rural North Carolina or in inner city Los Angeles, where the options are, well, I have to join the Junior Police Academy or ROTC now, otherwise I'm going to have to join a gang. Yeah. And then I'm going to have this job, and that means it's an illegal one. Or I can go ahead and sign up to be a part of police, military, or something like that. And there just aren't other options available to them. And it seems to me that one of the things the church could do is one, address the systemic issues around that, but also recognize that there are there are a group of men with lots of energy and angst and identity issues that the system is no longer giving a healthy place to find their vocation and serve, and find other options for them. There's no need that the only place you can get an education and spend 4 years community building and learning to have structured relationships involves a gun. Like, it could also involve distributing food or education and things like that.
Well, I think that's one of the mistakes that I've encountered with pacifists is that they assume that the military is one homogenous thing, where in fact, like, there's 4 different branches, however many specialties within each branch. That's another reason why I have some difficulty with the whole support the troops thing, as though that the troops identify as something at all like coherent. But like for me, so my difficulty is that I still don't want to be a hypocrite, and I've just completed, or I will just complete, my 3rd degree on the GI Bill. So I cannot look anybody in the eye who comes to me and says, I want to go to college and the military is my best option. I cannot say don't do it because I just did it.
Same here.
But I think the other problem that we face, like you said, that these young men want to do something with meaning, and we put so much meaning into the military, and there's a lot of money there, so you've got 2 big reasons to join. I was approached actually at a Mennonite convention in 2012 in Pittsburgh. I gave myself and another Centurions Guild member gave a talk at one of the youth meetings, maybe a couple hundred people. And I was approached by several young men in the course of 24 hours, each of whom said to me, I want to protect and defend, and I want to do something with, adventure. And my congregation feels like they'll disown me if I join the military. And so that, on the one hand, that revealed to me that that pacifist communities don't always carry over the stories and the reasons for their being pacifist in ways that young people can understand. But secondly, it made me think like, oh man, what should I tell this person? Because I literally just told them don't join the military because I'm a hypocrite. I thought to myself, well, you want adventure? You don't want the weapon? I said, well, become a firefighter. You can jump out of airplanes if you want. You don't have to have a weapon. You get to be in a place of danger. People love you. Women want to sleep with you.
There's lots of those jobs in California.
Yeah, exactly. It's not going down anytime soon.
Yeah.
But we can be creative at thinking about ways to make men and young women feel vocationally fulfilled in the church and elsewhere. But I think that's a really important question. Like, what do we do with people who want to have lives of meaning, but the military seems like their only option?
Mm-hmm. So the last question I thought of was really, how does your conversation and experience as a Christian soldier, a Christian vet, and this kind of thing, what kind of advice would you give for soldiers who are relating to non-Christians, right? Like where you talked about kind of essentializing Islam as the enemy when there are thousands of Muslim soldiers in the United States military. A part of the Bill of Rights, and one of the things I think is pretty cool we do is no matter who, whatever your religion or lack of religion, you get the support of your own clergy, like no matter where you are, like things like that. there's a sense that structurally the military actually recognizes the diversity and plurality of religion with a dignity that a lot of the soldiers have expressed when talking to me that isn't there on the ground. So what is it like to be a soldier in a pluralist army, but so much of it's Christian-y?
Right. For me, and this is a biggie. I think because I very much have been in a world of many, if not most, of my friends not being religiously affiliated at all. You know, being in kind of a artsy kind of crowd. You know, and so I think for me, a lot of my identity friction that came was. I might have experienced just as much between just being a Christian and being in that environment. I think there's something that we can learn as Christians and how we appropriate, and if I can call this, the various uniforms that we wear in life, the various kind of scenarios and groups that we find ourselves in. I think in Centurion Scope, we're specifically talking about military service. And so it's interesting because, you know, I found that in the military, more so than many realms of society, you're forced to be in a very pluralistic way and quite intimately. If I'm a student at some college, it's easy for me to get into my own cultural ghetto, to only hang out with people that kind of believe similar things to me, in the military.
4.5 point Calvinist Bible study.
Right.
If you go all the way on the fifth,
drop that L, cut it. Anyways, so like I think you have, it's interesting when you're talking about being a Christian military member. And so you're talking about having a moral voice. I mean, really, that's a lot of what we're doing and having some kind of, if you can call it, witness to how we can relate to the military, how we can maybe do the military better, do it in a better way, in a more maybe conscientious way, if I can use that term. And I, to me, it seems like we need more of that. We need more of that from the church, because if you aren't in the church, if you're religiously unaffiliated, which I think more and more that's what's happening, but also if you're a Muslim, if you're a Jew, you have assumptions about what it means to be a Christian a Christian soldier, you know? I mean, there are a lot of assumptions, and I think to be able to say, no, actually, this is what it looks like for me, and I am a Christian and a military service member or a veteran or whatever. So I think that's one thing. I think it's when we use that word witness, I mean, that's such a complicated term, but I think you can have this really profound kind of story that you tell and that you show, and that I think that could really be significant to both the church and to the military. It could really help to shape the military, change the military, change the church in some profound ways. So,
I struggle with the interfaith thing just because I don't think it's a strength of mine. I feel so. Stanley has this way of saying he called for modest proposal for peace. He said, "Let the Christians of the world stop killing one another." And to outsiders, that sounded incredibly tribalistic. Like it's okay to kill everybody else, but it's not okay. But what he wanted to relay is like, if we can't get this right, nothing else that follows will be coherent. Like, let's begin here and let the rest of it follow. That's why I think the golden rule is helpful. Like, we do to other people what we would have do unto ourselves. But more importantly, maybe more specifically, like we do not know who we are apart from community. Christianity does not exist in a vacuum any more than I do. And so if the rest of the world is looking at a Christian nation and saying, you're belligerent, you're overbearing, you're violent, then that says something about what we actually are. And it was helpful for me when I was in Iraq. I was an outsider because I was an artilleryman within an infantry unit, and because I was the redhead stepchild, when it came time to house the interpreter, he was placed with me, and so for 6 or 7 months, whenever we were in one location, I would bunk up with the interpreter. And it was interesting listening to him. And I don't know if I had any expectations beforehand of Muslims or Iraqis, but it was humanizing to hear, like, he went to university, he had a degree in engineering. He worked as a carpenter for a little while before he became an interpreter. And then I started thinking, one of the things I started thinking in combat that made me start questioning the structure and the structure of meaning that we give to war, I started wondering, oh man, what would it be like if, like, the Chinese had invaded America and I was enlisted as a Chinese interpreter and I'm walking around watching Chinese people shoot at Americans? Like, how shit. Like, imagine that for a second. And that's why I think, like, the community thing is important. We need to listen to our neighbors in faith. If the church is being these things, we need to take that for what it is and just consider how it is that we fail to be Christians. One of my favorite passages, I hate favorite passages, but I have one of a couple, and that's that, the world will know Christians by their love. I don't always know I'm a Christian. I'll trust it when people tell me that I'm loving them, that somehow I'm in line with what it means to be a Christian. And that was one of those things that forced me to think about violence and my part in it. Both directly, I could not be an artilleryman, but also indirectly, I have to recognize that I'm complicit in the system. And I have to think creatively about ways to interrupt that system in whatever ways I can. I don't know if that's interfaith or not.
I mean, it makes sense to me why, and again, like, I mean, I feel like even the story about the translator is one of those where your own experience and things helps reframe the way we'd even want to address and think through the questions theologically. Normally, they're just so abstract. So, thank you tons for joining us and staying on the line. And Matt, it's always good to see your face. Yeah.
Sorry we didn't get into any high school stories.
Well, we'll have to do that again another time.
That next time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Logan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been really good listening and chatting.